Hey everybody, today is Monday, November 1st, 2021. Coming up on the show today, from the French Dispatch, editor Andrew Weisblum.
We were basically finding ourselves working on a completely new film that had no overlap from the previous one, which was a pretty big obstacle. Editing is not just where you pick your cut point, but all the ways you can invisibly manipulate footage and image to enhance a story. A lot of times Wes will design a shot that has a lot of moves or whips in them, and those become cut points for us.
Yes, all that and a few things more in this edition of The Rough Cut. All right, bonjour mes amis, bienvenue à La Rough Cut. Thank you for joining me for the second week of our Léa Seydoux tribute. All right, not exactly, but she was in No Time to Die, which we covered last week. I hope you heard that one. And she also plays a prison guard, believe it or not, in the film we are talking about this week. And that film would be The French Dispatch. The film is written, directed, and produced by Wes Anderson, which right there would tell you that it's a film that belies simple explanation, but I will try anyway. Here goes. The French Dispatch is a film with 3 short films within. It's about a fictional Kansas newspaper that has a foreign bureau in France, as would only happen in a Wes Anderson movie. The editor of the newspaper, Arthur Howitzer Jr., played by Bill Murray, dies suddenly of a heart attack. According to the wishes expressed in his will, publication of the newspaper is immediately suspended following one final farewell issue in which 3 articles from past editions of the paper are republished along with an obituary. And what are those 3 stories told by the journalists within the film? Well, the first is about an imprisoned artist named Rosenthaler, played by Benicio del Toro, whose muse is a prison guard, as I mentioned, played by Léa Seydoux. The second vignette is about a reporter, played by Frances McDormand, who reports on a student protest breaking out in the streets. It is a revolution led by a young rebel named Zeffirelli, played by Timothée Chalamet. And then the third features actor Jeffrey Wright playing a reporter who recounts a tale of his having dinner with a police commissioner, or commissaire, I suppose. And during that dinner, the commissioner's son is kidnapped and held for ransom. And as off the Parisian wall as all that sounds, it is, as I said, a gross oversimplification. But it'll do for now. The as yet untitled film was first mentioned in August of 2018 as a musical set after World War II, which would have been pretty interesting too, I think. Later that year, the film was officially announced, with Anderson calling it a, quote, love letter to journalists. Filming took place between November 2018 and March 2019, and the film was supposed to be released in July of 2020. Well, you know the rest of that story. Big delays happened. Ultimately, The French Dispatch had its world premiere at the Cannes Film Festival on July 12th of this year, and then was theatrically released here in the United States in the past couple weeks. And hey, somebody had to edit this movie, right? Right. And that someone is frequent Anderson collaborator Andrew Weisblum. The French Dispatch is the 5th film that Andy has cut for Wes. In chronological order, the first 4 would be the Darjeeling Limited, Fantastic Mr. Fox, Moonrise Kingdom, and Isle of Dogs. Of course, Wes Anderson is not the only notable director for whom Andy cuts, or cuts with. He has also lent his editorial wizardry to Darren Aronofsky, including the film for which Andy would receive an Oscar nomination, 2010's Black Swan. So, much to talk about with Andy, and we will get right on that after I tell you a little about 2 companies who can help you a lot. Are you working remotely? Of course you are. But the truth is you probably have been for a while anyway. Why? Because talent is not bound by time zones or geography. Your production team members could be anywhere. And no matter where anywhere is, the best way to share media amongst your team is with Massive, curiously spelled M-A-S-V. They have made it their life's work to solve your most challenging media problems. Namely, how to easily, safely, and efficiently share even the most enormous of media files. You know, files that result from you shooting all that beautiful high-res media. Massive's pay-as-you-go model means you only pay for what you need, and unlike other media sharing providers, there are no limits to the size of the file you can share. So go ahead and send uncompressed videos to your team around the world and speed up your production cycle. Honestly, who doesn't need that? And since Massive is a member of the Trusted Partner Network, you know your invaluable media is safe from any kind of harm. Plus, if you sign up today at massive.io/the-rough-cut, you can get 100 gigabytes free towards your transfer. How about that? I will put a link in the show notes to make it easy for you. But once again, that's massive.io/the-rough-cut for 100 gigabytes free towards your transfer. And now that you know the best way to share your media over the cloud, make sure that the audio you're sharing is from Extreme Music. Since 1997, they have been providing filmmakers and artists like yourself, maybe even artists who are nothing like you, who knows, but they have been providing the very best in production audio created by multi-award-winning musicians and composers. Big names like Junkie XL, Sir George Martin, Exhibit, Deadmau5. How's that for a little variety? You just go to their website, extrememusic.com, sign up for a free account, and do a little keyword search on things like lyrics, genre, tempo, instrumentation. It's really fun. It's really simple to do. all online, or they can personally lend a hand from one of their many, many worldwide offices. You can get your track served up just how you want, right down to the stems, and dial in exactly what your project needs. So visit our friends at Extreme Music, who helped to bring you this podcast, and make your story sound its very best. Okay, time to dispatch with the promos and get down to the business of talking about editing. From Wes Anderson's The French Dispatch, here's Andy Weisblum. I saw some reviews this morning, and it said, most Wes Anderson movie ever, which I thought, like, okay, good, I'm on the right track here. But having just seen the film, I'd love to hear how you describe it to people. I think that might be a fun place to start.
Well, I think I just describe it in terms of what the premise is. So basically there's a magazine in an indeterminate period in the past. It's kind of a strange spread of like 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Doesn't ever quite define it, but it's the past in a fictional French city, which is Paris, basically, where there are some expatriates there with an arts and cultures magazine in the vein of New Yorker, and they're putting together the last issue of the magazine. And the film is made up of all the different pieces that will end up in the last issue.
I think another fun place to start would be the last time you actually saw the movie, and when did you shut down the Avid? Because like a lot of movies, it's been a while.
We started filming it at the end of 2018, very end of 2018, into 2019. And the bulk of 2019, I worked on it in Europe, and we finished some drips and drabs on it in January of 2020. And then it was done. And we haven't gone back in since then. It's just been waiting for its time in the sun. It was originally supposed to be at Cannes in 2020. And then obviously that didn't happen. So then it became this year's premiere.
Well, when you say drips and drabs of things you touched up, it always feels like you don't have enough time, or you'd like to have more time to work on them. So when you say drips and drabs, was that Wes saying to you like, hey, there's a couple of little flourishes I'd like to add, or a few things I'd like to tweak?
No, it was just some kind of overhangs of different visual effects or music things or little touch-ups that we were waiting to come in that were behind the curve for whatever reason. And we had at the time, we thought we had plenty of time before the release in May. Little did we know that it was going to be that much more time, but we weren't continuously tinkering. It was more just because there was all this extra time. There were a lot of visual effects in the film, way more than originally anticipated. So we had to kind of get all those through the pipe and the approval and design process and everything else.
Well, by all accounts, and by all accounts, I mean IMDb, The French Dispatch is your fifth film with Wes, dating back to, I think, Darjeeling Limited in 2007.
Yeah, well, let's see. Yeah, there's Darjeeling Limited and Mr. Fox and Moonrise and Isle of Dogs and now this.
Yeah, roughly 15 years of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought something fun to talk about would be how you met Wes and what it is you enjoy most about his style and his process that has kept you signing on to these projects over the years.
I met Wes through mutual friends. When he was looking for an editor, I happened to be working with Zoe Cassavetes on a film called Broken English, and he was friends with her, and that's how we met. But simultaneously, I had been recommended to him as an editor by Jeremy Dawson, who's a mutual friend, who's his producer, or continues to be his producer. We had worked together on The Fountain, because he was a visual effects supervisor on that film, and I was a visual effects editor. And so he took a shot on me then, and we started out together, and, you know, the rest is history. I guess the things that I enjoy about working with Wes is, you know, he really creates, as you can see in front of the camera, he really creates a family where he regularly works with a lot of the same kind of company of actors where he develops a relationship with them over time. And the same is true behind the scenes, where there's a real camaraderie and loyalty and family on these productions where we all live together and share time together and share ideas together, which find their ways into either the film that we're working on or the next film or whatever. It's kind of an ongoing blurred collaboration. I mean, I think the warmth of that is something that it's hard to find in other projects where there's other considerations, whether they're professional, political, whatever it is. Wes seems to clear the room of that business. And we're really just focusing on the details of the film, which is intense work, but it's all on screen and it's all very focused.
Well, through that collaboration with you and the other recurring team members, Wes has really established a style that is both easily recognizable and unique to him. You know, of course, it's the most Wes Anderson movie ever. So you know within minutes that you're watching a Wes Anderson film. But I also feel like that it's a style that has come into sharper focus toward the latter part of his career. For example, the look and the feel of The French Dispatch is a lot closer to Grand Budapest Hotel and Moonrise Kingdom than it would be to Bottle Rocket or Rushmore. I apologize in advance for what I believe is a tough question, but are there films the two of you have done over these past 15 years where you can point to, this is the film or these are the films where we established this new aesthetic, or ways that the way you and Wes have worked together have changed with certain films?
Well, I think people might be surprised that stylistically, the things that are recognizably Wes are not things that are necessarily conscious. I think it's more about taste. There are certain kind of preferences he has in terms of symmetry and how to shoot certain things that always kind of a tableau and blocking, camera moves, coverage, that all are consistent from film to film because that's his taste, that's his style in an unconscious sense. I don't think there are rules necessarily in terms of that. It's just how he ends up doing it, even if he tries not to do it that way. It still kind of gravitates towards what he has in his head and what he sees and what he feels and what he wants. You know, over the past 15 years, the references have changed in terms of the films or filmmaking that he's seen or become interested in, or other kinds of movies that appeal to him. I mean, it's too diffuse to really point to ones that are obvious references, but I think it's clear in the kind of conscious resetting choice for each film that there are, whether it's Japanese cinema in Isle of Dogs or French cinema in French Dispatch, that there's a pretty clear set of influences that fall behind that. Some of it would be, in this case, it would be French cinema, but there are other films that find their way in as a reference point where we will look at something or talk at something, or I'll bring something to him that I'm reminded of when we're watching or working on something that then kind of folds its way in there. I think that that's the way the films change. I guess in terms of working style, from when I started to work with him on Darjeeling, there were no storyboards really. But at this point, almost the entire film is storyboarded and done in an animatic before we're even shooting. I guess that's something that evolves from the animation process. The animated films that we worked on, we weren't particularly interested in what everybody else's method was going before, but we did learn from a lot of that because we were both novices at animation and we worked with a lot of experts. But I think Wes recognized right away that the animatic process was a good way to not trip up and be wasteful in the shooting day and kind of maximizing your budget to get exactly what you need on camera and not wasting it on anything else. And also just figuring out the feeling of the movie. I think that that's something that has changed from before, where we have this pretty detailed roadmap. There's always room to deviate from it, but I think that that has changed the style of the films and allows them to be a lot more focused in their details.
So I do want to follow up on the influences part of it, and maybe there's not much more to say on that topic other than French cinema. But you said something in your answer that I had to follow up on, and that was Wes consciously not doing something with such a pronounced style. Are there ever times he looks at something and says, no, that's just way too me. I can't do that. That's a little over the top.
I can't recall that ever happening that specifically. But I do know that he's aware in his, sometimes we have the conversation where one of the notes I remember feedback we were getting on Mr. Fox was that a lot of the shots were done in kind of elaborate masters, and the lack of a close-up sometimes was felt. We recognize that as a tendency, and sometimes we know we need a close-up. I guess that's something that's not the first instinct. Usually it's trying to figure out telling a story or staging a scene through blocking of actors and camera, like Spielberg would. But also then we realize, okay, well, maybe we need the punctuation for that thing, or we need to put a cut there to emphasize the shift.
I will definitely be asking you about that and the punctuation, which is something I wrote down here somewhere. But just going back to the influences, the marketing around The French Dispatch has indicated that the film is a love letter from Wes to journalists and an homage to The New Yorker specifically. I always like to ask editors about reference movies or any kind of reference material. But again, having such a pronounced style of your own, I think more often than not, his work is what's going to be referred to from other films. But suffice to say, you said French cinema, but any specific films or even imagery, music, written works, anything like that he might have said to you or the rest of the team, like, this is what I'm going for, either tonally or stylistically or even to some degree a narrative?
One of the things we have on these films, or we had, was sort of a lending library of DVDs of films that Wes had watched. Obviously, Tati is a big part of it. I'm trying to remember what there was a Tintin kind of influence in it, which isn't really cinematic, but it's cultural. But, to be totally honest, I kind of avoid that. I just want to kind of look at the film for the film's sake. I feel like the references are already baked in the execution, in the shoot. It doesn't necessarily expand it in an interesting way for me, because Wes knows what the references are. So I will tend to find other things that are maybe not such obvious references and see how they can play in. It's hard for me to think of an immediate example on French Dispatch, but I know there were some. But it happens on all the films. We're watching something or we come up with something, or I'll send them a YouTube clip of something that I remembered that might inspire some other idea.
You mentioned the evolution of your process with storyboards to an animatic. Is that where you begin in the Avid? Are you actually editing from an animatic? How do you actually start to begin to edit a Wes Anderson film?
I don't do the animatics. His former assistant, Eddie Burch, does them because he's good with After Effects stuff. It's stuff I do too, but it's just, there's no reason for me to do that because then I'm also too married to that anyway. But then we'll have that and we'll look at it together, or Wes will ask me to look at it because he's mostly using it to plan his shoot. But I'll suggest maybe we need a certain shot, or maybe this moment doesn't work, or whatever it is. It's usually not critical. It's usually just if there's an idea to expand on. And then from an editing point of view, usually the cut is based pretty straight off an animatic. I will know what the select takes are, and I will know really what he intended from the animatic. And it's pieced together from that first. We tend to, at least initially, work on multiple scenes remotely, like by email, like either during the shoot or at the beginning of post, where we have kind of like a template of what the scene was. And it's at that point that we'll get together and sit together and start to experiment with it, when it's kind of like laid out against the original plan. I'll have other ideas or other approaches or things that I think aren't clicking from what we had planned, but I don't usually bring those to the table until we have the version that I think most closely represents what the original intention is. The other thing is I spend a lot of time on the set during the shoot because he doesn't need me to find it in an assembly. He's not shooting it that way. He's not shooting coverage where we need to find a scene. It's very clear what coverage is meant for where. It's not like, did we get it? Becomes a topic of conversation. But I think I'm a useful presence on the set when I can sit with him and not be focused on any other logistical issues and say, maybe we need another take with this, or maybe we need a different size of this. Maybe are we getting this idea from the shot? The thing that we thought we would get from the storyboard or from the script, or is that coming across, or do we need to adapt? I'm able to kind of call out those things, and he can ask me questions about things he's worried about. And oftentimes I'll be cutting either with him on the weekends or during the evenings, or if he's concerned about something, I'll put it together to see if we need to pick up something else while we have the actors. And usually the actors are around with us for a very tight window, unless they're the leads, because they're all such short parts, 2-3 days at most. I kind of hustle to make sure that we're covered. In French Dispatch, there's this little scene with Saoirse Ronan where she was just there for basically 30 hours or something. We had been having a lot of discussion about what would be black and white and what would be in color. And the initial story, the Rosenthaler story, was meant to originally have the most black and white. But we were all falling in love with it so much that we decided to expand it further and further into the other stories and use color basically to pop and for emphasis. And it was because of that and during that moment that I suggested that we should get a point of view of Saoirse looking through the grate of the doorway to pop her eyes, that the only way that would work would be a color shot, because there was never a point of view shot planned. It was just meant to be the two shots on the side. So that's an example of something like where I'm just thinking about it there and they only have one day with her. And, I think obviously that's a moment that works, but it's not something that anybody else is thinking about in the moment.
Well, as you said, the film is made up of 3 short vignettes, individual stories by the journalists on the French Dispatch. Although there are some elements stylistically amongst them, they do stand on their own. But did you edit them as if they were 3 short movies, or did production and schedules dictate that you just worked on whatever came in?
while the production and schedules were based around the different short films. We were basically finding ourselves, after 2-3 weeks, working on a completely new film that had no overlap from the previous one, which was a pretty big obstacle because we had done the animatic for the first section. We were maybe 2/3 through the animatic for the second one, and we had barely started the third one. And they weren't shot in order. It was Rosenthaler's was first, the Commissaire one was the second one we shot, and then Zeffirelli, the Timothy one, was the third one we shot. And that was the one that had the least storyboards. But at that point, since we were already rolling in production, it wasn't really the time to get an animatic together as a communication tool for everybody. So everybody was kind of dependent on this animatic as a roadmap for everything and the production planning. And they were like, wait, we're shooting another movie, completely different movie next week. And we don't have this storyboard to tell us what we're doing. So that was quite a challenge to figure out what was needed. I mean, it worked out fine. It just, we became dependent on this tool that suddenly wasn't there for us.
That obstacle aside, not having that roadmap that you've come to rely upon, did you find that it helped you be a little fresher as an editor? In other words, instead of laboring over one complete feature, having these short films to do allow you to sort of cleanse your palate a little bit and make it a little more fun as an editor? Yeah,
it's fun to mix and match. I mean, it's a lot more dense, the work. And you're not even thinking of it as a whole piece. We barely watched the whole movie in its entirety until pretty late into the process because we were working on these individual films. Sometimes I would be working intensively on the Commissaire stuff, and my associate Steve would be recutting something in Rosenthaler. You know, we would be bouncing around between the different stories. Usually when you're working on a feature, you'll watch it at several junctures and think about the pace of things in a certain section and how you would reshape something to balance out some other issue or just overall scope. But it wasn't that kind of work. It was much more focused, detailed work because it was so compartmentalized.
So I don't mean to ask you which of your kids is your favorite, but in this case, did you have a particular favorite of the 3 shorts to be working on? And if so, why?
Well, they're different. I mean, they were all fun. A lot of them had a lot of detail effects work and subframe editing and, you know, splits and morphs and all kinds of business that we were doing that was kind of fancy footwork that was fun to do. And then something like the Zeffirelli story, the manifesto story, was much more jazz in terms of figuring out what the cut was and little sparks of performance that we liked and how it was going to play out because there wasn't the same roadmap. And that was fun. That was stuff Wes and I would just cut together pretty quickly, just pushing together the things, the beats that we liked. Such a strange little story. Rosenthaler, in its sense, is structurally pretty straight, but the other two are, particularly the last one, are way less linear. So there's a lot of, like, if you were to ask me chronologically what was happening, I don't know that I could even articulate it that clearly. But I knew why we were going from this moment to this moment to this moment in terms of the train of thought. I just couldn't lay it out on a set of cards chronologically what was going on, which is a weird thing to cut. It's also true with the Zeffirelli, how we introduced this character who's going away to the mustard region for war, and the flashback is done as a play in the future. This whole construct is just making light of and playing with nonlinear structures in a film.
You certainly do that. And, you know, we've talked a few times now about how tightly choreographed Wes's projects are from the beginning with the storyboards and the animatics and using those, you know, to go back and figure out what to shoot. But is there still room in editorial for as much exploration and change as you might like with that in mind? And if so, where does that play out? And what made me think of this is your comment about the nonlinearity of some of these stories where you kind of could go a lot of different ways.
Yeah, well, but even with the script, it's pretty tight why we're going where we're going. If I were to unravel that and make it linear, it would make even less sense probably because the connective tissue would be missing, and I don't even know which connective tissue I would be missing at that point. It would be so convoluted. But there's always room to experiment, and we always find ways to take something that you think is pretty tightly constructed in its shooting technique and how it's staged and find a way to repurpose or invert things to clarify something or to de-emphasize something. I mean, we're constantly doing that. But that's not the initial step. The initial step is let's work it the way it's intended, and then the floor is open to kind of play around with it, as long as it's not undermining the intentions. and there's a reason to do it.
The cinematographer Robert Yeoman, like yourself, is a frequent member of Team Wes.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about just sort of the family atmosphere. Did the two of you have any discussions during production about what he's shooting and how it will translate in editorial? Again, going back to that careful construction of everything?
All the time. I mean, I talk to Bob all day, every day. And we have dinner together or drinks together or whatever. And we're always with each other during the shoot. And more often than not, Wes, Bob, and I will sit and, particularly on Dispatch, we'd watch the film. We'd watch dailies together after wrap while waiting for dinner and just talk about things that we're seeing or things that we're doing the next day or things to pick up. When we worked on Moonrise Kingdom, Wes and Bob and I lived in a house together where we would watch dailies, and then we would also have people over but there was a group of us of the keys, the department heads and producers would come over, and we would have dinner together. We kind of pulled together and had a chef that was cooking for us. And it was a great way to kind of, without it feeling like work, sit and talk about what we were thoughtful about for the next day or the coming days or what's coming up on the schedule, what we maybe did or didn't get the day before, what we can adjust. It's a great way to work together as a family, and I think Wes encourages that kind of interaction as much as possible, both on and off set.
One of the reasons I asked about Bob, I still call him Robert, is these little zooms. Most of them are subtle, but a few are on the more dramatic side.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, those are things you can and usually do in camera, especially the more dramatic ones. But then you're locked into going with that for the shot. So tell me a little bit about the thought process around these zooms and just doing things in camera versus in the edit. When it makes sense to do things in camera and when it's better off to leave some freedom to do that in the edit.
I mean, I think those are choices that Wes and Bob are making together. So it's all pretty conscious in terms of zooms and things like that. I'll say that of all the cinematographers I've worked with, Bob is also the primary operator, and he's the best operator I've ever worked with. If there's a zoom that's supposed to happen on a beat, he'll nail it every time. If you watch some of these shots that have multiple pans and moves in them, he will nail them every time and very precisely. There's nothing wishy-washy or accidental about those moments. And it's not often that we wish we had an alternative. There's also flexibility in that stuff. A lot of times Wes will design a shot that has a lot of moves or whips in them, and those become cut points for us to switch takes. Even just in like long dollies, or there's a dolly that has Jeffrey Wright's characters walking through the police station when he first introduced. So each one of those rooms is effectively a different take where we find cut points in them. But we shoot it knowing that, and knowing that we're going to hit. We don't shoot with like a mocap, a motion control or anything. We just know that like Sanjay, our grip is going to be precise enough in those crosses, and he knows that he has to hit the timing consistently. So he has like a whole janky method where he's often listening to a metronome and has a laser pointer and markers on the floor so that he knows when he does a move that he's in the right pace or not.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. But that's his technique. He has other techniques like that, but that's one that, he's an artist, Sanjay.
No question. Well, I mean, part of the artistry also is the framing. I mean, why 4:3 and not widescreen?
Well, I mean, Wes has been playing a lot with aspect ratios in the past few films, so I think it just came from the influences. But, we do pop to scope at various points. But I think he just uses it as an aesthetic language to differentiate between different things sometimes. We also play with a lot with different size split screens and placement of text as a graphic element instead of just an informational element. Those are all things that we play around with in post that are not necessarily planned in advance. Those are experiments.
So quick tangent, since you brought up the titles, I noticed that you have a credit from Devil Wears Prada for doing main title design, which is a one and done for you in your credit list. And again, something that's one of Wes's flourishes in his films is the unique way you treat titles.
Mm-hmm.
Just real quick, how was it you got to be the main title designer for Devil Wears Prada? And tell me about your role in the titling in French Dispatch.
Devil Wears Prada, which is some time ago now, I was an assistant editor in New York and visual effects editor, and at the time, films were often edited in facilities where there was a lot of community, I mean, that's still true now where people edit in facilities when there's not, pandemic concerns. But it used to be more so, particularly when projects were shot on film, because you needed to be in a facility with more specific equipment than, your computer film equipment. And you needed to be approximately close to screening rooms and labs and so forth. So we were all everybody knew what was going on in other people's movies. It was all kind of inside baseball and everybody was friends. And I knew that my friend, David Rago, who was working on Devil Wears Prada, was doing some titles, and I was hanging out with them one day, and they were bidding out that work to different people, and I had done some title work on some lower budget things. There's no credit or anything for it, and I said I could do that, and I did. I got effectively hired for it because it looked so simple. And then the next thing I knew, David Frankel was asking for all these different kinds of things like reflections and flares and holdout mats and stuff, which was just great for me. I just got to learn to do it. So I did it. But, it's something that I kind of took a liking to, is that editing is not just where you pick your cut point, but all the ways you can invisibly manipulate footage and image to enhance a story. And that includes all the visual effects tools that we have, whether it's splits or morphs between characters, subframe editing, and different production design visual effects, which Wes and I do all the time. We're constantly changing the images. But also we played around with the subtitles, where we picked the font. I forget where the font came from, but it came from one of the prop elements. And I sort of made a font out of it online, and then I started using it as the subtitling font. But we were also just playing with how text looks on black and white films in the 50s and stuff, and how it's used in a very, not Saul Bass, but kind of very graphic ways, that it's kind of a strange glowing translucency to it, and how rather than just using it as a boring informational element, that it could be more decorative and energetic. A lot of the times, it doesn't even matter what's being said, and that you read it, and that you spend time to digest it. It's the musicality of it that we were going for sometimes than anything else. And so it was fun to play with that it was like another percussive instrument. Besides where the cuts were, where the sound effects were, is these kind of graphic flourishes that we would have.
So you already kind of mentioned this. I don't know that I'll do a deep dive into this question, but the changes between black and white and color, sort of like the zooms, is there a cinematic psychology to why and when you use those? I mean, you gave the example of Rosenthaler and, her eyes. Same thing, that Rosenthaler short, cutting back and forth between the talk that Tilda Swinton's giving, that's all in color, very bright, vibrant orange, and then back to the black and white of Rosenthaler. So that's a pretty specific, this is a jump in time and place. So one's in color, one's in black and white.
Right. I mean, that's the obvious one, is that it helps you immediately differentiate between a setting or time. Like the stories were primarily black and white. The forward moments or the framing devices were usually in color. But there were always kind of meshing exceptions to the rule. And I think that was more just instinctive, interesting stuff. There wasn't necessarily a overthought theoretical to it. There might have been originally, but I think Wes just liked the black and white stock, as we all did. We thought it was beautiful. And we knew that the more we used black and white, then the more dynamic and energetic it would be when we did cut to color. It's also the black and white stuff allows stuff to be so specifically graphic in terms of the framing and composition. All the storyboards are in black and white, and the framing decisions that were made in that context. So the black and white kind of allows you to focus in on the graphic detail and where your eye is focused.
Because of these rich, tiny details in Wes's shots, and there are so many, you said this before, about the wide shots that are employed to help the audience take all that detail in. Does that influence your cutting in any way, perhaps in that you might notice the cuts more because of this style, and you don't want to make it too cutty, or you don't want to make it too cutty so you can give the audience time to really absorb these details? How does that affect you in terms of the cadence of your edits?
Yeah, I think it's a part of it. It depends on the sequences. I mean, if you think about like the Sazerac Owen Wilson section, which is almost all individual wide shots, where basically every cut is a new set and a new environment. You can't make that too cutty, or you shouldn't make that too cutty. But then there are other things where the information in the frame isn't changing that much, where it's just dialogue that's going on, where it can be more so. And we usually cut things pretty tight. But I don't know how much I'm influenced by the information that's getting across. But it's definitely a mix and match of styles editorially.
So staying with the theme of these big, beautiful wide shots, and also taking into account the very rich dialogue that Wes gives to his actors, and as great as they are, it's still a lot to deliver. You mentioned this a little bit, just relying on splits or animats or morphs, any techniques you use to keep those great composed wide shots, but also be able to manipulate some of these performances between the actors where you can't cut to different angles or play around with it in that regard.
I'd say pretty much anytime you see a shot with more than one person in it, there's a split. And it's just because why? I mean, unless there's something so perfect, we tend to manipulate timing and little hidden speed ups, little hidden splits all over the place, because you can just kind of keep tweaking and refining the timing until you have it just so. Hopefully they're all invisible. That's the intention. They're not always photoreal. I mean, sometimes it's more just for the energy of it. You know, something like the waiter going up, the Tati shot going up, all in the different rooms of the building is obviously all different cuts and not physically possible. Same with mixing the drinks, which probably has over 50 cuts and respeeds and morphs in it, and the split when the tray goes up in the air, and, you know, all these different tricks. The whole film is that way. I mean, that's just the tool that we use constantly. And it's kind of an unspoken thing with Wes and I, where we're like, okay, so you're going to do your thing now with it. And I'll just go there and basically see what I can collapse and what I can judge and what I can emphasize. Sometimes it's even to expand something just a little bit, just to get a punctuation for it. And usually it's made up of different takes. If we have a scene with a whole bunch of extras in it, certainly, or even non-actors, sometimes it'll be 8-9 takes mushed together of different people in different positions doing different things. The ennui opening up and the rises suddenly on a Monday, there's the one shot there that I think has probably got 16 different splits in it, plus a miniature for the background and an animation element that's too complicated to get into. And there's this one dog that runs around the whole space that's made up of 4 splits, because the dog went in the one way, and it's all different takes. And I had to, he went close to the foot, so I got to cut around the foot and make a shadow for him. And, so it's all that kind of stuff. But you just kind of keep rolling until you get all the pieces you need, and then we just collage them together. I mean, all the cats on the rooftops, that's probably 50 different shots of cats stuck together on a street setting that's made up of 3 different reel plates plus a miniature.
That's a lot of work. On a note related to dialogue, I was speaking with Barney Pilling a while back about the terrific work he did with Wes on Grand Budapest Hotel. Mm-hmm. And he said that Wes doesn't like to do any ADR in his films.
No, we do very, very little. None. Almost next to none.
So why is that? And in your experience, does that create any specific challenges or benefits for you as the editor?
From my perspective, it's always better not to do ADR, because usually you're asking an actor who's now in a different headspace to, on a dime, get back to that just for, technical clarity. And it almost never has the same tonality or energy that it does in the shoot. And my tendency used to be, if you can understand it, then there's no reason to replace it unless you're going to make it better. And what's the definition of better? Just because it sounds cleaner and it's easier to mix is not better. Quite often, something that Wes and I will do is there are many, many takes that he does. Even though there's not a lot of coverage, if we have a master, we could have up to 30, 40 takes, just because we know we're going to have hidden cuts and do different things with it, and it keeps evolving. But it also gives us a lot of takes of performance. And we end up stacking all the different readings of the dialogue, phrase by phrase, not even line by line. So if it's a comma, it's got a new phrase. And Wes will listen to those, all of them, and say, all right, from take 15, I like these 3 words. But from take 20, he said this word the right way. He emphasized this the right way. So I want to see if we can get from this to this. And then for the end of the sentence, we should use take 30. So then we have this kind of roadmap. And I'll build it, or I'd have Steve build it. And then we'd listen to it and say, we're never going to get from this to this because there's too much of a projection change or something that happens. But we keep refining and refining it. And I can tell you that most of the dialogue is built that way. It's rarely are there lines that are just straightly delivered. And that's part of why the music of the dialogue is so specific, you know, and the rhythm of it is so specific because we do that stuff. The only exception to the ADR rule, I mean, we'll do wild tracks with actors on set, but it's more the energy of the set and the performance that I think Wes wants to hold on to. That's probably more important than anything else. I mean, there are exceptions. We'll loop some things, but it's rare.
Well, since you brought up the musicality of the dialogue, we should probably talk about music. Another semi-regular in the Wes Anderson theater company is composer Alexandre Desplat. And the score in this film, I would describe as a layperson as really present throughout, and that it's almost like another voice in the film.
Mm-hmm.
And this is certainly not a needle-droppy movie. So original score is predominantly what you have to work with in terms of music. Do you like to have temp score in place early on when you work to help build the scene and find the rhythm, or do you prefer to hold off on the music a little bit and let the dialogue and your own internal clock find the rhythm?
Well, we do have a few songs in the film.
A few, yeah.
And there are things centered around those songs, and usually those are predetermined. Wes knows that he wants to use those. Then I'll have other influences or ideas, like, for instance, we use some Delarue score a lot in the Zeffirelli story, which was something that was temped in the animatic that then carried through to the film. And I think early on, Wes and Alexandre decided that that worked well, and there wasn't necessarily a need to replace it, and then we could use that, but that the other sequences, the other stories, needed their own signature and their own score. I don't really remember how much temp we used in those situations. We don't do that a lot. I mean, I know on Mr. Fox we temped with Morricone, but on this film less so. I mean, there's a very specific process where we share our earlier cuts with Alexandre, and he presents Wes with sketches and ideas of things that he thinks might work tonally for the overall film. Not necessarily assigned to specific scenes, just different thematics. And he and Wes will go back and forth with that. Wes might have me lay it up on certain scenes just to see how it's sticking to the picture. But then we'll have kind of that vocabulary. Alexandre will then share those demos in a very modular form with the music editor, where it's split out into all the different instruments and some different parts and different layers and ideas based on a theme. And Wes and the music editor and me, to some extent, will take that material and build a roadmap for the score based on those demos, which, you know, we'll say maybe at this cut or this scene, this instrument will drop out. And here, maybe this could come back in. And that becomes pretty sophisticated in terms of how we want the score to work. That then goes back to Alexandre, and he and Wes sit together and they listen to that together. And Alexandre will then put his signatures on top of it. Because obviously that's a bit repetitive. Ultimately, like, you know, the modular version of that score is not necessarily fully flexible in how it's going to work or hit certain things. So Alexandre will add different ideas on top of it, or try and do the same thing compositionally instead of editorially. And then we kind of have what is our score. And we work with Conrad Pope, who's an orchestrator arranger who works with many other famous composers and a composer in his own right, who then kind of fleshes out those ideas. They work together. And that's kind of how the score evolves organically with the editing process.
So we've talked a lot about Wes Anderson, and rightly so. He's the director of this movie, The French Dispatch. But there is another notable director that you've worked with in recent years, and that's Darren Aronofsky.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious about how you would compare the styles of the two directors, and if there's anything you've learned from either director that sort of cross-pollinates, that you take with you into your work with the other director.
Well, they have some commonalities, which is that they're both very individualistic and distinct voices who are not necessarily interested in a studio process. They're also both very determined and detailed about the work and finding the best versions of scenes. Tonally, obviously, they're very different, and the films feel very different, but they're both independent voices. I think that in terms of my working styles with them, Darren wants to see my assembly from the beginning of the post process, and he doesn't really watch much unless there's a specific issue during the shoot. And he uses that as kind of a distancing method to basically look at the film and say, okay, well, here's what's working, here's what isn't, here's something that Andy understood from what I was doing, So clearly that's right. And here's something that he didn't, and we need to figure out why it's not clicking. And then so we'll pick through that together, and he'll say, this is great, or he'll say, this is not what I was thinking at all. I was thinking we do this. He'll say, this is not what I was thinking, but it's better than what I was thinking. He'll say, this doesn't work. I don't know why. Let's figure it out. And we just kind of have a process together where we work very closely. But the shooting style dictates that as well, because he does shoot quite a bit of coverage, even though there are very clear decisions on shots and camera placement. A lot of our discussion that Darren and I have these days, it used to be that we used to focus almost entirely on watching all the footage and honing performance, but I think we have the same performance instincts now in a lot of ways. So there's less of that. It's more deciding grammatical questions, like what shots will be used where in the tempo and structure of a scene, whether we're in close-ups for this section, whether we're in a wide for this section, whether we use this camera move or that camera move, or what's the best way around the room and so forth. Wes, as I discussed, is like the roadmap's all there. He's gone through an extensive process of getting what's in his head onto the screen, and I put it together based on that. And it's after that that I feel my input really comes into play. And I'm able to kind of experiment and play with him, and he's open to those things because he's exercised whatever the demon is of what he was trying to do in the first place. Which both approaches are completely valid, and they're both collaborative, and they both come up with something that, we creatively improve upon together. It's just a timing difference in a funny way.
Well, other than Wes or Darren Aronofsky, there is one other director that I have to ask you about before I let you go, and that's John Waters. Towards the end of your assisting career, you assisted editor Jeffrey Wolf on John Waters' Dirty Shame and Cecil B. Demented, which I think were his last two features.
Yeah.
What are your recollections of that experience, and anything that was helpful to you as an editor or otherwise that you took away with you?
John Waters is one of the nicest people I've ever known, and funniest. And those movies were always a lot of fun to work with him and find creative ways to play with them. Jeffrey and John gave me a lot of freedom as an assistant to play around with visual effects ideas and stock footage ideas and kind of help them with some things, particularly on Dirty Shame. But he's the best. I just love working with that guy. Their movies were small scale and there wasn't a lot at stake, but they had such punk spirit. I mean that in the nicest possible way. Like there was nothing nasty about them, all things being considered. But I just remember on Dirty Shame, the funniest aspect of that was that, he spoke about this publicly on that film about the MPAA, how that film received an NC-17. And, there's no explicit sex in the film, but we were all just kind of stunned by the conservative viewpoint of the MPAA, that they felt that there was no edit that we could do that could tonally change it from an NC-17 to an R because of the subject matter, just because it was about sex addicts. One of my ways in on that process was that Warner Brothers or New Line, and I may not have all the details of this, we were required to deliver an R-rated film. They weren't going to release an NC-17 film. But I think John, through his long-time relationship with New Line, managed to get that waived under the condition that we arrive at an R-rated cut that could be on the shelves at Blockbuster Video, because that was so important to their bottom line. So I was tasked with coming up with the R-rated cut, the neutered version, as John called it, that would end up at Blockbuster. And that was one of my first substantial cutting assignments, was if we couldn't figure that out, then there was going to be a problem. So I think it was Ted Hope, the producer, had the idea that maybe the R-rated version could be about foot fetishists instead of sex addicts. So using some awfully strange stock footage and some creative recutting, there is a neutered version out there. I doubt it's available on streaming, but there was a DVD that was on the shelves at Blockbuster, and I was responsible for that abortion of the original intent.
Well, I will keep an eye out for that, and I would never take the term punk spirit to mean anything but a positive. Before we go, Bill Murray, he plays Arthur Howitzer Jr., the editor of the French Dispatch.
Yep.
And the sage advice that he gives his writers is to try to make it seem like you wrote it that way on purpose, which seems perfectly apt for editors. So when you're showing a director, whether it's Wes or anyone else, a cut, and they really like something that you may not have intended, are you trying to make it seem like you edited that way on purpose?
Always, right? That's the thing. You can't I've often, not to be too serious about it, but I've gotten plenty of calls and things about recutting movies or trying to help movies that are having problems. And sometimes it means that they're trying to invert or go back on the original intention. And I think you can always see through it. I mean, I know that I've worked on movies where I've known there was a problem and improved something. But even if the reviews are positive, I'll always see the thing, whatever it is, mentioned in some reviews where somebody will notice whatever it is. You can't really hide behind the DNA of whatever it is that's going on in the movie. It is in your best interest to try and lean into whatever was the intention, almost always.
Well, Andy, the good news, other than you have a really great movie, is that you survived the interview. The bad news is you got another movie coming out really soon that we got to talk about. You up for a rematch?
Sure.
All right, game on. I'll see if I can hold Andy to his promise and get him back in here to talk about his next movie. Who knows? Maybe we can even get editor Myron Kirstein to help us twist his arm. Whether Andy comes back or not, I'm sure glad he showed up today to talk about The French Dispatch and his editing career. I learned a lot, and I hope you'll join me in sending Andy big thank you vibes for doing the show with us. All right, I got a bus to catch, so I'm going to call this one for today. As always, I appreciate that you took the time to check out the podcast, and I sincerely hope you do so again. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.